I want to begin with a story about a woman named Jean Griswold. This is a book I bought last fall. I bought a book called Women of Courage. I think that's right. Something like that. About different women who have confronted different issues. And this is a story about Jean Griswold. She was the wife of a pastor somewhere. It doesn't really tell where the story, East Coast somewhere. And that she had gotten to that age where her boys, she had 3 boys, and they had grown or off to college at least, and she had spent most of her time while they were growing taking care of them, and now she was at a place where she really wanted to expand herself and get some meaning out of her life and do something to connect to her community. And so she went to look for jobs. I mean, she wasn't thinking much beyond that. But at the same time that this space happened, when she was ready now to go out into the workforce and kind of do some other things with her life to make some purpose, she also came down with a diagnosis for multiple sclerosis, which would, of course, discourage many people, but she seemed to be of great spirit. And early on in multiple sclerosis, she still felt like she had a lot to give to the world. And so she began to go and make applications. And she said she had one really good friend. She asked, "Would you be a reference for me?" And after she'd applied for 2 or 3 jobs and not gotten the jobs, not received the jobs, she found out that her friend, when they would call and ask for a reference and say, "She's a really good worker for somebody with multiple sclerosis." Well, you can imagine in the heads of the employers are going, no, 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 I don't want to do that. So she couldn't get hired. So she thought, well, I'll hire myself. I'll start a business. But she couldn't think of on what. She didn't have any particular interest or hadn't considered a business of any sort up till this point. As I said, her husband was a pastor. And in her church, she suddenly became aware of an elderly woman who was seeking to have help at home. She didn't want to go to a nursing home. It wasn't ready for a nursing home yet. Didn't really need that kind of care, but needed someone to help her out at home. She had plenty of money, resources to pay for somebody to come. They'd be there 24 hours. But found out there wasn't anybody who did that. And so Jean Griswold decided, well, maybe I should start a business where we connect people to help folks in their homes when they're dealing with illness. And by the time she kind of came to this and began to think about the woman who needed it originally had passed away, but she saw, I think there's probably a lot of people with that issue who they could take care of themselves perfectly well if they could stay home. And so she started a business creating a care in the home. And she actually resourced seminary students to begin with, people who needed some jobs and their schedules a little more flexible. And so she and her husband had some connections there, and so she began doing that. But the need for this was so great that the business began to grow and get larger. She said she got to the place, and she was working out of her home because she couldn't travel, so she needed to have her people come to her, and she'd call on the phone and make connections, but she couldn't really travel. But she got to the place where there are 6 or 7 cars parked every day, some coming and going, in her neighborhood. Well, you know how city councils are about that sort of thing. Big cities, they have a zone. And in truth, it is sort of a nuisance when a business, if you're living there and suddenly you got a business next door. And so they were going to close her down. And she told them her situation, said, I can't drive, so I need to be close to my work. And they said, well, we'll give you a little bit of time to figure that out. So what she and her husband did was they found a building with an apartment upstairs, and they moved themselves so she could be above her business. And they had to put in one of those stair lift things because she was getting at the place where it was difficult to do stairs. And in fact, as time went on, they had to put an elevator from her house because she was physically limited by multiple sclerosis, condition that does limiting muscles. But she never seemed to lose her enthusiasm. So she kept this business till it began to grow all along the East Coast. And over this whole time, by the time she finished her work, she connected to about 50,000 people that she connected with and added services for that weren't able to get them before that. Now, she had to sacrifice a few things, vacations, hobbies. She said even her connections to family and friends were shortchanged. And time off was never really time off. And of course, when you live above the business especially, that happens. So she took a situation where she ran into a barrier, both in terms of people hiring her and in terms of an illness, and decided that she still wasn't going to let that stop her. And so she found a need, actually a need that not only gave her a business and some income, but a place where a caring need that was out there for people to be cared for that no one was meeting. She found it and created really kind of a ministry as well as a business. Now, I want you to think about that story as we look at these scriptures this morning. And that first one in Isaiah, really the focus of that, I think, or at least where we end up on this story often, is where God lifts us up on eagle's wings, that takes the weak and the broken and those who can't run are able to run. And certainly this woman, Jean, fits into that image of someone who, for most people, they find out they have multiple sclerosis, they start slowing down, and she began to speed up. And that a big part of that was her faith. Her faith was a big part of making it possible for her to do that. She had this enthusiasm that she wanted to add to life. She wanted to give something back to her world. Now, she did it through a business, but I'm thinking it probably wasn't a business that was totally unaware of or concerned about people who didn't have the finances. And it doesn't say that in the story, but I'm kind of guessing her background that they probably made it work for people of all kinds of economic situations. But at any rate, it was a need that was already there, and she filled that. And it's the kind of need that we talk about when we look at what Jesus talks about for the oppressed, the broken, the blind, or Jesus' ministry to healing that we see over and over again. 1 Corinthians is a passage that reminds us that the gospel is intended for everybody. No one, if we can find people that are in need or different groups, we need to. This is a strong statement. We tend to get into places where we connect well with people who agree with us, but people with different categories, we just can't quite get there. And here's Jesus really, or Paul rather, really challenging us to say, my first priority when I meet the stranger, when I meet someone who's not like me, or when I meet someone who's outside of my group of comfort, Paul says I'm going to shift who I am in order to get to them so I can bring them back to be with Christ, because all those other labels don't matter. I need to become what I need to become to connect to somebody. Now, in our polarized world we live in today, we know how hard it is. I am speaking for myself here as much as anyone, to really shift and even hear one another when we come from different perspectives, whatever those are. I mean, it can be in various ways. We can't even begin the conversation, let alone get to know the other person. And so Paul is really challenging us to do that, to connect where there's a need. Now, I think this Jean story maybe doesn't do that in quite the way. Her connection is always, do you need help? She didn't ask any other questions. So that's a little easier way to get around some of those barriers we put up. Now, the fishing story, though, I think really fits into this idea of never stop fishing. Peter here is very much challenging and suggesting that we've already tried, we've already done it. What's that expression we use all the time, that we've never done it that way before? We've already done that. We've already tried that. It didn't work. I mean, you've all heard that expression before at one time or another. We already tried that. That's kind of what Peter's saying to Jesus here. We already did that. We worked really hard. There's nothing out there. Luck's not. And Jesus says, no, you need to go back out and do it. Now, the thing is, he does listen. He does listen. And he does two things. He listens and he fishes where they had not fished before. Although that's really more of another story. I'm reminded of John 21. You remember John 21 after the resurrection? And they've been fishing on one side. Jesus says fish on the other side. And they pull up. Now, this is always an interesting piece of this story. They pull up 153 fish. And I think everybody who's ever read that story goes, why does it matter that it's 153 fish? And I want to say to you, first of all, nobody knows. But one primary theory that seems nice, and it seems to fit with our understanding of what Jesus is about, especially as he's calling the disciples to go out, is that 153 was, in Jesus' day, that's how they numbered all the people in the world. They thought there were 153 nations. So that's one theory, that this is one way of saying Jesus says preach to everybody. The gospel is for everybody, all the nations of the world. Now, the other interesting thing about the end of the gospel here in Luke 5:1-11 is when all of this got said and done, here's the dramatic statement that the disciples left everything. They left everything and followed him. Nothing else was important anymore. They left it all. Now, that's quite a challenge to us as well. And we see a little bit of that in Jean's story, where once she was involved in this business ministry, that whatever was before her was possible. Now, one of the issues I want you to think about in terms of this story and in terms of these gospels is that we need to go where there is a need. We need to go to people where we haven't thought to go before. And lots of churches have over the years come up with doing daycare centers. I don't know if you know, in lots of churches you'll see daycare centers are in churches. And part of that is because in some place or another churches say, here's a need, and it fits with our gospel. We can help the community. Hopefully we'll make enough money from the charging to keep it going and pay for the bills. But, that's not the primary goal. The primary goal is to serve the community and make it possible for women to work who, mostly women, probably men and women, who couldn't work if they didn't have daycare for their children. And to make a daycare that also has a little bit of a Christian education piece to it as well. And so we've seen that. Well, as I was reading this story, I thought, well, here's another thing. I don't know that I've ever heard of a church doing this, although some churches do have counseling. But here's something churches might look at, as they look out and see a need like this, where people in homes needing care. Because I don't think I know there are businesses that do that, but I don't think that's a need that's ever been filled yet, of people needing. And that doesn't necessarily mean that church people would do it, but maybe we just host it, organize it, whatever. And I'm not suggesting you do that. I'm just saying, when you look and see what's out there, you see needs, and maybe what it is here is something else, and you get just looking in the same places you've always looked in the past, and ask the question, where's a place that we can transform the world? Because really what God is calling to, and remember I mentioned that last week, that our Methodist purpose statement is to make disciples of Jesus and transform the world. Not just make people feel more comfortable, not just get people ready for eternity after death, but to actually change the world today, to make it more Christ-like. I mean, that's what Jesus did. He didn't just talk about, he did healings. He changed people. He helped people. He didn't just talk about eternal life. And it's not just what we speak. It's not just platitudes of faith. When you're witnessing, a witness is how do we, as a church, find ways that as we look out and see what's not working, that we can make a difference in the world. And so I thought this story is just a reminder that there are opportunities that we might not think of as church business or church opportunities, but they are ministry possibilities that connect us to those fish we haven't seen before. I don't know if people like being called fish, but well, my mother-in-law had a story of what would you call model. She said guests are like fish. After 3 days, they begin to smell. You probably heard that. But so I don't know if we like that comparison of fish. But there is that call for us to get out, stop doing the same things over and over if nothing's happening, but open our hearts and our spirits and listen to God calling us like Jesus does to Peter. Listen. And what do you see? What's possible? What would it be? And to get out of all the forms of saying this is not something churches do, maybe if it serves the community and adds to it, maybe it is something the church does. So that's what I bring to you to think about today. That story, just an illustration of somebody who saw something and made a big difference in a big chunk of her world. What is it we have the opportunity to do? What is calling us? What is Jesus calling us to this day? And we ask you, as you think about that, and as we gather our offering time, and we'll move to the offering now, to ask you to think about as you bring